Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show, man. How's it going?
Yeah, really good. Yeah, having a nice time. Sun's out. Well,
Performing any stand-up comedian? I didn't know you were actual stand-up.
yeah, I've been doing stand up a lot for about the last sort of 4 years or so, and particularly post pandemic, the last 18 months, I've been doing a lot of stand up, and also performing at some quite weird venues as well. There's a place in Hyde Park in London which is called Speaker's Corner, which is sort of like a kind of a place where people go for sort of to exercise freedom of speech. So I go down there sometimes, and that's sort of less overtly stand up, but it's sort of kind of similar thing. And I talk a lot about NATO and war in Ukraine and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and those kind of things to
I was
whoever.
curious how you made that funny. How do you make that funny? Because that just sounds like a dead
Well, like I
topic.
said, it's probably not that funny, but it's quite funny because the people at Speaker's Corner are quite. They're often quite. They like to heckle a lot, and the audience kind of makes it funny. There's a lot of shouting, a lot of barracking, and a lot of people sort of messing around. A lot of tourists coming through who are just having a laugh, and so yeah. I do sometimes sort of I do write lines as well that are kind of funny in the political speeches that I do, but that's perhaps not it's not quite the same thing as doing sort of more flippant stand up, which is what I do most of the time. But yeah, I've been gigging down there, and yeah, and just performing around the area as well, and as
Do you
well
have a
as
specific joke? I hate to be that guy that's like, "Tell me a joke, Mr. Funny Man," but do you have like a specific joke that that gets a good amount of laughs? I usually just tell like storytelling stuff, but my best joke is probably recently at my work. I work at a gym. I was in a parking lot and a guy had pulled up beside another car and wouldn't let him get out. Basically, you can't even open up the door. And then I just see this car back up and I stop recording on my phone and I go, okay, this guy's probably leaving. It's 3:30 in the morning. So I'm like, what could this person want? Pulls up right beside me and goes, roll your window down. And I'm like, oh shit. And I roll my window down. He goes, hey, you know where the gun shop is? And I'm like, whoa, what do you mean? He's like, but he knew my name and everything. He's like, Robbie, could you tell me where the gun shop is? And I'm like, oh God. I was like, I don't even know if there's one in Maryland, and that's where I live. And he's like, of course there's one in Maryland. I Googled it on my phone. And I'm like, nah, sorry, man, I can't help you. He goes, all right, well, and then he went to go ask me another question. I rolled up my window. I went inside and I talked to the guy he asked first. And I said, Bob, I said, did you give him my name? He goes, yeah. And I go, he was looking for a gun shop. He goes, yeah, I thought you'd know. And I was like, if a guy asks where a gun shop is at 3:30 in the morning, you either roll up your window or you get the fuck out of Dodge, man. And he just kind of looked at me and goes, oh, I didn't think it was a big of a problem. I was like, okay. But that's like I had a joke that I mean it's an actual real story thing, but I usually expand it longer. I kind of just chopped it up here, but that's my one liner. Do you happen to have one?
not that I can think of right now. It's late.
It's early for me. It's around lunchtime.
Yeah, it's I'm about to go out. I'm performing tonight just at an open mic. So I'm leaving here in about an hour. And so I should have some jokes in my head. Usually I often refer to my own appearance because I look like the sheriff from Stranger Things. And that usually gets people responding. And I talk about how I'm not the sheriff from Stranger Things because he's an incompetent chain smoking drunk and I am not a sheriff.
That's a good one. I wanted to invite you back on because the first time you were on, we talked a lot about the influence of the military into film. And I know Top Gun 2 kind of woke a lot of people up to it. It didn't spark up my interest with Top Gun 2. I kind of knew a little bit before, but just not how deep it went. And then since our first discussion, I dived down the rabbit hole of the history about it, the history of Hollywood. I never asked you what your thoughts were about the military influence into movies. I mean, do you think that should be allowed? I think in some cases, like small propaganda, but then I just don't think it ever stops with small propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly talked about this in other interviews that I don't think there should be a sort of blanket ban on on hardly anything, but certainly the government should be able to cooperate sometimes under certain conditions to make movies better. But that's the excuse that the Department of Defense and CIA, etc., are giving all the time. That they're important in making these films more authentic and more accurate. but they're doing that so systematically, so wide, in such a widespread way, often rather covertly, and in fact, for 40 years, almost you know, uh, uh, deceitfully, really, because they weren't releasing the information about script changes. So it's just gone. I think there is an argument for maybe a sort of mustachioed old general in an office somewhere in the Pentagon who can give a bit of advice about how what military uniforms should be worn and what kind of language would be used in battle. But it's not that. That is not what is happening. It's not there for advice. It is there to control narratives.
I mean, we can talk about different stages of this, but I mean, what would be your focus if you had to choose between, I guess, the care about the people that are directing movies, like free creative content, or do you care about like the public perception? For me is a big one, mostly because I remember whenever I saw like a movie with like either gangsters or mob figures, and then I saw the police were the good guys and the mob figures were the bad guys. Well, then I learned about organized crime and the assassination plots against Castro, and the government's working with the mob, and I'm like, wait, was that just a lie? Was the mob really these enemies, these people we should hate? And then I look into the history of like bootlegging and all these types of things. I mean, I could have been a mob guy. I mean, if you would have lumped me in that category, it's much like we kind of paint the brush at communism. So I start going, is this a lot of propaganda that's been sewed into my head? And it makes me examine every film now. I'm gonna be like, good God, is anything real anymore? I watched the new Fast and Furious, and I can tell you it's 100% bullshit.
You bothered to go to that, did you?
I did. It was actually yeah. I have so many. I'm not going to spoil it
This
for
is
anybody.
this is Robbie. This is you frying your own brain.
It was a lot. My buddy, this is his favorite movie series, and I thought this was the last one. And then at the ending, I'm like, how are they going to wrap it all in like 10 minutes? And he goes, there's two more movies coming out. And I'm like, oh shit, I got to sit through this two more times. I've been through 10 of them now.
So, what's more important, public perception or kind of the creative rights? I guess for me, public perception is the most important thing because this is about shaping history. Um, uh, the whole way that American foreign policy is viewed is being and has been for decades twisted by these systems of power. So I think that's a really bad thing. But I would say that an important secondary concern is that when the Department of Defense and others get involved in movie making, they almost invariably make those films worse. It is very rare that they make them better because they strip out anything that's interesting about the content, anything that's new, anything that goes against the tide, anything creative, anything surprising. And so invariably they make products worse. They might make the product look slightly better by providing an aircraft carrier or a helicopter or whatever, but creatively they are. It's very bad to bring the government into to anything.
What about examples of foreign policy? Could you give me some?
Yeah, I mean, so I did a whole book on this with Tom Secker in 2017 called National Security Cinema. There's an enormous number of films that have foreign policy themes. Black Hawk Down is kind of the most obvious one because it's about the US involvement in Somalia. But there are a lot of it seems silly to list them really because there are hundreds of these things. But ones that come to mind, one about North Korea, The Interview, made by Sony, which was about blowing up, killing, assassinating the dictator of North Korea. Various ones about Iraq, various ones about there's one coming out later this month called Kandahar, which is about Iran and about Afghanistan. So there's a constant stream of foreign policy films, and then there's also kind of films that are that relate to foreign policy in that the baddies might be Russians, and that includes TV series like Stranger Things and stuff like that, or Homeland, which has Iranian villains and all sorts of Middle Eastern villains. The TV series 24, which also became a spin-off movie. There's kind of Argo, the film about Iran. There's kind of constant stream of several high-profile movies each year that come out that relate to foreign policy themes, and often really quite tightly relate to foreign policy themes. And very, very commonly, those films and TV series work very closely with the Department of Defense, CIA, other national security or security agencies, with them effectively acting as executive producers, having editorial control over those scripts. So they're exerting an enormous influence directly over popular culture. And really, until we've done this work, the idea that the government controlled or exercised a considerable influence over popular culture was not really accepted, in certainly not in mainstream publications. The idea that the government was controlling what was on your TV 25 years ago would have seemed fanciful. It would have been a conspiracy theory. Um, but that is exactly what we have discovered, particularly in terms of controlling movies. And that there was a cover up with that, which involved the only historian who was working on it, but he was also on the quiet working for the Department of Defense. So, and then therefore not releasing a lot of the vast majority of the information that he had about this relationship between the Department of Defense and film producers, entertainment producers. So it's really important. I mean, it's always been known, obviously, that the government has an impact on the political culture, on the way that politics is discussed. But the idea that the government would have an impact on the entertainment culture is really odd.
Including any film that could possibly be a critique or a critical thought on what the government was doing, such as like a Vietnam take or something like that. I mean, there's a new trailer for the Oppenheimer movie that's going to be coming
Oh,
out, and
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to know if there has been government cooperation with Oppenheimer. I'm imagining not, and certainly I've not seen anything yet on that. Um,
It seemed like it when they played the trailer, it seemed like they were, talking about how they were on a rush to beat the Russians to get this thing going, this weapon that was going to be, insane. And there was danger that came with it. But thank God, like these scientists, these amazing scientists pulled it off type deal, which I looked at it, I was like, oh my God, that's got to be 100% influenced by something. I mean, to make a film like that, and I already knew they were going to use the name as soon as I saw Oppenheimer or whatever the person they called Oppenheimer in the beginning. Like that's just the title of the movie, I bet you. And then right at the ending, there's the title of the movie. But I can't not see it now. I can't understand like even the relationship with Hollywood back in the day, the things actors had to do to portray themselves, the way that the FBI betrayed themselves into film. It just at this point, I start looking at everything like there could be a slight bit of propaganda, whether it was 100% funded, like this is going to be 100% a propaganda film. I don't think that, but it's changing history. If we talk about Oppenheimer and what it might end up being, or any other films that have came out that could be historical significance, my generation is disconnected from that. They don't know anything about the Vietnam War unless they learned about it through a textbook. They didn't experience it. They didn't get to be around it during when it happened. So then we're watching a film to get our basis for what it was possibly like back then, and it could be largely skewed, and no one might ask questions about it.
yeah, it's obviously a problem, isn't it? Because we all get information from popular culture. I think some people. I did a talk the other day where some group of people were saying, well, there's people don't really watch films as much anymore because people don't go to the cinema. It's like, well, people might not go to the cinema very much, but pretty much any night that I do stay in and I turn on the TV, there is going to be a film which is on somewhere a lot. And I've only got I'm one of these people who's only got about 20 channels or so on my TV. But every night that I stay home, I always find something. It's either Terminator 4, or it's Independence Day, or it's Air Force One, or it's a whole TV series. And it's always the case that there is something is being repeated, that is in some way shaping history, shaping these kind of narratives. So I think the influence does persist. And yeah, it's a very bad state of affairs. I mean, there are. I should emphasize though. I mean, there are films that are really, really good and politically really interesting, and also challenging to state narrative. It's just that they don't tend to get very much support. They don't tend to be very well funded. and the actors involved often have to take a pay cut. There was a film actually on TV the other night called The Report, with Jodie Foster and Benedict Cumberbatch, which is a really good film a couple of years ago about Guantanamo Bay. It was a good drama. And there was a film called Vice with Jeremy Renner, I think it is, about the Vice President Dick Cheney. And there's, of course, Oliver Stone's films, which you will know well, including things like Snowden from 2016. So there is a list of material out there which is really good and really challenging to American foreign policy narratives. But it's
They have to go overseas. Oliver Stone has to go overseas to get his funding, even for his
he
JFK
has to go
movie.
overseas to get his money, yeah, and always has done since the early '80s. He's always had to take foreign money, and there's a nice illustration of that as well. That when he was filming Snowden around 2016, his mother died during the production of the film, but because the budget was so tight, he couldn't fly back from Europe to go to his mother's funeral. So this is someone who's one of the most successful filmmakers of all time, who simply didn't have the money to the budget to take the time off to fly back to the States for a couple of days. You know, that's how tight the budgets can often get on films like this. So it's very difficult for these kind of oppositional narratives to get through, but they still do. So it's not that you can still make a really good. I still think, if you wanted to make a really good wall of DVDs of Hollywood movies that were really exciting and interesting and countercultural and honest, you could still do that. It's just that the wall on the other side of the room would be much more stacked with much better funded products. And that's simply, that's just simply the reflection of a dominant ideology and then more marginalized ideologies.
Well, it's
Um,
less censorship, less China, more East Germany during like when the wall was up, the Berlin Wall was up. Like the censors were real people, but they would just look through certain things and they would try to eliminate. You couldn't talk about censorship, which everyone was like, okay, that's fine. We agree to your rules, and you have to kind of find ways to work around that. Which, like I said, I don't think like it's 100% like we shouldn't have any of this in there. I just think that you should have both. Like you would think that with like an equal society or at least a democracy, the United States being a democracy, you would have this aspect of like trying to have both opinions and views in there rather than just not eliminating one, but just not giving the time of day to one. Like if you're funding a whole bunch of stuff to create your perfect vision of America or the army or the United States military, whatever you want to say, I think you should at least try and fund things that might be more critical on some of your actions as well too. I haven't really seen any CIA or FBI or DoD or any of that type of critical films before.
No, I don't think they're very interested in doing that. In fact, there's a good example of that in the '90s. There was a film called Fields of Fire. This is a really interesting case because the guy who wrote Fields of Fire was the Undersecretary of State for Defense. He'd just finished being Undersecretary of State for Defense. Um, he's called James Webb, and the book of Fields of Fire was used for the Marines as a standard training piece of standard training literature that they had to read it. It was critically acclaimed and it was universally accepted to be accurate about everything it was saying about the Vietnam War. But because it included, and in fact, also not only that, the Marine office said, "Yeah, we'll cooperate on this film. We'll make this film with you. This is fine." But the PR office overruled them. That's the PR office in the Department of Defense. And that's because there were certain things in that book and in that screenplay, which even though even the rest of the military was happy to show it, there were things like burning down villages, and there were things like killing superior officers, fragging, and those kind of war crimes. The rest of the US military, and I don't agree with the US military in general, but the rest of the US military was like, yeah, let's get that out in the open. Yeah, we can talk about that. It's fine. That's what happened. And so we should have a discussion about that. We should have a film about that. And it's based on this amazing piece of work by the Undersecretary of State for Defense. but the PR office was just like, nah, we're the ones who are going to put the kibosh on that. So there is, yeah, it's that level of extreme. Um, they're not interested in letting anything come out.
Do you think the all should be exposed, like the warts and all a little bit? Like, I mean, I feel like if they make a film, let's say about Vietnam and they're burning down villages and stuff like that, they have made films like that before. We have films out there about Vietnam and burning down villages and homes with people inside them. That's been exposed. But I feel like they also spin it a little bit too. Like for instance, the MK Ultra film that came out. I was so excited, man. I was sharing it on my Facebook. I was like, this is gonna be awesome. Then I'm watching it. I removed the link that I shared and I go, don't watch this. They took too much blame off the government and kind of put it more to like, oh, well, this is better than getting a lobotomy. Like, for instance, if you examine it from a film perspective, the kid's in the middle of getting a lobotomy, like they're drilling into his head or putting the ice pick in the eye and all that. And the phone rings. Stop, don't put him in there. We're going to put him in this project where we're going to give him LSD and see if that treats him. It's like, well, that's not exactly what they did. They dosed Americans who were not known of being like consenting to being dosed with LSD, and people went on horrible freakouts and killed. And this has all been documented. So that was kind of like the MK Ultra film, and they titled it MK Ultra, where I go, even if it was a specific moment in the MK Ultra program, you titled your whole film MK Ultra, so people are going to now view this as like, oh, this is MK Ultra that I heard about, and they look at it and they go, oh, that's not that bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it reminds me a bit of that film Men in Black, which obviously for decades there was the myth of what Men in Black are, which are these sort of spooky figures that come around if you've seen some anomalous ufological event. And they were kind of myth and legend, but then of course no one knows what Men in Black are anymore because it's just like, oh yeah, you mean the movie.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, I mean, even if are we going to start seeing like historical stuff like the Oppenheimer movie that could be coming out, and then a bunch of maybe future ones where they just kind of they acknowledge the issues with it, but they spin it in a way where the PR team could just be like, "Hey, we're going to make this look a little bit better for you, so dampen the blow a little bit," and then you got it out in the open, so there's not a whole bunch of like shock and awe when it does get
Yeah,
exposed.
yeah, in fact, let me give you an example or two on this. So for years, from 1991, there was something called the Highway of Death in Iraq, and it was when Iraq withdrew troops, um, so they were retreating from Kuwait, and the United States bombed the retreating Iraqis. They killed maybe 10,000 people. Cameras weren't allowed in there, but like there's one famous photograph of this sort of burnt out corpse sitting in a truck like this. Um, that was called the Highway of Death. But a few years ago, a computer game, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, a video game came out which was also called, which also had in it the Highway of Death. But that atrocity was blamed on Russia. So, and it was a fictional atrocity. So effectively, what you had is this well-known phrase from the 90s and 2000s, which associated the United States with this war crime, but simply by washing it, sort of laundering it, if you like, through the entertainment system. That phrase now, if you Google "Highway of Death" now, it doesn't come up anymore. US
I would think a
American
metal
property
band or
on
something.
it comes up the name of the computer game. I'm really sorry, I've forgotten.
Modern Warfare?
Think it might be World of Warfare. Yeah, it was one of the famous ones anyway, one of the big ones. So yeah, those kind of things happen all the time. Trying to think what the other one I had in mind was. So when they did Godzilla, I think it's the 2019 Godzilla that's mentioned in our documentary Theaters of War. They talk about that they watered down the discussion about the about the atomic bomb, and just sort of say, this is about man's inhumanity to man or whatever, instead of talking about the dangers of this technology. And in fact, the whole film is about how the technology can be used for good, how nuclear weapons can be used for good, including to try and destroy these monsters in the sea, which is completely inverting the original purpose of the Godzilla story, which was meant to be a critique of nuclear power. So these kind of things happen all the time. Now, I'm not saying that in the case of Highway of Death or whatever, that they are necessarily completely deliberately doing it for very specific political reasons. But obviously, in many cases, they are. In the case of Iron Man, for example, where they inverted the narrative, Iron Man was originally the script was originally a very anti-war, anti-arms trade uh, screenplay, and then Tom Secker and Tricia Jenkins document it in their book from about 18 months ago about superheroes in the state. They document how that those changes happened over about six pages in their book, using original documentation. They document how Department of Defense influence meant that the resultant film, Iron Man, ended up with him being a character who's basically saying peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy. So not opposing his father's armaments industry at all, but just using armaments for supposedly good ends. But none of this is, none of this is good. I guess it depends how bad and how dangerous you think the world is as well. Because in the end of the day, it's like you asked that question about, does it matter creatively? Yeah, it does matter creatively. It means that you end up with more boring films, and that's not great. But the extent to which it matters politically depends on the extent to which you think the world is a bit of a mess and potentially could get a lot worse. I think there are huge risks in having Americans propagandizing themselves and British people propagandizing themselves with this kind of with these hyped up senses of threat, these hyped up senses of self righteousness. I think it's really dangerous to have that, and I think if we didn't have this popular culture meshed so closely with the political culture in such a dangerous way, I think we'd have a lot more civilized societies and a lot less fraught and frenetic and insane discussions, particularly about foreign policy.
Do you think it's more concern of the way the public views their own government, or do you think it's more of a concern of sending a message to another government? Like, I mean, if you could take a poll, maybe it even shifted at some point. I would have thought maybe it was worried about the way that the public views the government in the beginning. And then now I see a lot of films where it's like, why did you do a film like that? I don't feel anything after this film. I actually feel empty a little bit. And it's like, was that for us or was that for the other government? Every spy movie now I see is just like, oh, you're just hyping up your own spies, trying to make them seem like badasses. 007 is a good example. But then there's plenty of CIA and FBI movies that come out where it's like this. I mean, Lethal Weapon, for God's sakes, a rogue cop attached to authority or whatever you want to say. You're just looking at it like you're just trying to, I don't know what you're trying to do. Show that every cop's a badass. I don't know. Every undercover cop doesn't play by the rules, but they always get the job done. Something like that, where I start noticing, I mean, is this 100% for me as a citizen to think differently about my government, or is this for another country to get the film and be like, man, those FBI agents and every cop on the street happens to be a badass with a nice perm or something. I don't know.
It's funny you should say it because that is uh, generally speaking, when we're talking about these things, I'm referring to how Hollywood or network TV is deceiving or shaping narratives for the public. And
Yeah,
that's the
never fuck with
primary
Tom
problem.
Cruise.
However, I agree with you that it does sometimes happen that they and the CIA seem to do this a little bit more. Sometimes their message is more directly to their enemies. So I'll give you an example or two there. I'm sorry, this is off the top of my head, and I haven't looked at this material for a few years, but there was the CIA's PR person was talking about Enemy of the State, the Will Smith film from 1998, and also about a TV series called The Agency from around about the year 2000. And he was asked in an interview, why do you keep putting in all of these um, uh, capabilities of the United States military as though it has this power to surveil terrorists like this and have these other forms of technology? We didn't really think we had that kind of technology yet. And his response there was, let's make them think that we have that technology because terrorists watch TV too. So this kind of thing does happen to some extent. It is about power projection. And in fact, if you think about even towards the end of the Cold War, for instance, a lot of the American embassies all across Eastern Europe were stocking VHS video cassettes at that time of American movies as ways of kind of promoting American cultural hegemony against the Soviet Union. And indeed, I'll give you one other example as well, which is another kind of interesting one with that case of The Interview, the Seth Rogen film, and James Franco film. That was about the assassination of the leader of North Korea, and it was worked on by the State Department, and it seems by some CIA operatives as well. The production history on that one's a little bit fuzzy, but that's certainly what
They put it on thumb drives and flew it over into
and
the
they put
country.
it on thumb drives. They put the movie itself on thumb drives and flicked it over the DMZ in Korea, so that they would, to try and encourage an uprising, and certainly to encourage the idea that Kim Jong Un is not infallible. He's not a god. He's just, he's just someone who can be made into a movie character like anyone else. And doing this in a kind of broad comedy.
See, there's the
So
new risk right there, is that now you're putting celebrities in the way of whatever your propaganda message is, and that puts their life at danger, depending, especially messing with Kim Jong-un or whoever. But also, we have them now speaking about things that I don't necessarily want my celebrities speaking about. Like, why are they talking about government issues and standards and things of that sort? They're going on TV and talking about a bunch of things that are no relation to acting at all. They're just giving out political messages, and they feel like they have to. And I feel like because we drew them into the whole political realm when we started getting them involved into movies like this.
yeah, I mean that's obviously, celebrities have always been doing that, but it does seem sometimes more galling than at other times. At the moment, you've got this long list of celebrities, Sean Penn and all sorts, going into Kyiv in Ukraine to support Zelensky, and the Eurovision Song Contest was, sorry, that's a thing in Europe, which is kind of like a celebration of Europe, and that was all. That was all very much about Ukraine, and I understand that impulse, but obviously all the celebrities who are involved, whether they're large celebrities like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I was just watching a couple of days ago talk about Putin, or smaller celebrities like just comedians from Britain, for instance, who I come across. Everyone just wants to trumpet the same old line, and it's not a critical line, and I think it's really, really harmful if you just have whole societies that are being sort of beefed up and with a megaphone, just following the sort of pro-war lines of their governments. It's a
It
very
drags
dangerous
people into the
situation.
political realm that necessarily don't want to get political. Like, it's hard. I've talked to just plenty of film historians who aren't even focusing on the political aspect of things. And they're like, the films are political. Everything has a political thing to it. Even Marvel films, all these types of films, they have something in there that's included in there that you can analyze it. Maybe it's over analyzing at times, but it's also, most people just want to see their favorite celebrity, and they get a favorite celebrity, and then their celebrity makes a statement about a certain policy or certain leader or certain country or certain whatever that's going on, and then they feel like they need to hop in the boat on that, and it drags them into the political realm. Yeah, it's just difficult to really understand. Like, you don't want media. Hollywood's always been like this, though. They have a really crappy history with communism and all this types of stuff. So it's difficult to try and say, should we just eliminate it all? Well, it's always been like this. I don't know what it would be like if we didn't have that
Yeah,
influence.
I think it's just a bit of moderation. I think, as far as I'm concerned, it's like I don't want to. I think there's loads of good Hollywood films. I think there's loads of good things about our culture and our civilization. It's just, one of the key things is that we allow these kind of pro-war myths to flourish. And what do you expect? Arms companies and opportunistic politicians and military figures. What do you expect them to do? Of course, they're going to go for that and pull on those narrative threads. So, for me, I think if we can make it, if as a species we can get through the next few years without destroying ourselves, that's a bit of a success, really. I think we should just wind down on the imperial wars, and I think we should go back to where we were just a few decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago, when we were looking at a peace dividend coming out of the Cold War, and I think we should be developing treaties with other countries and pursuing arms control agreements with other countries, pursuing dialogue with other countries, just in the same way that we did in South Africa with the end of apartheid, just as we did with the end of the Cold War. And just as we did with over environmental issues at the beginning of the 90s as well, with things like the ozone layer, which we seem to have fixed really, really well. International cooperation is what I'm all about, really. And I think that movies and TV series promote the opposite of that, and celebrities promote the opposite of that, because it's simpler, because it aligns with the interests of the people involved in making it. And because they're so closely in bed with the U.S. national security state.
But they could easily support, like, go the opposite way of what they've been doing. They can easily support and actually be able to produce some change and some peace resolution as well too, by making a film about it as well and using that as propaganda instead of trying just to show how badass we are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm fairly limited in what I sort of expect or demand. I agree with you though that probably would be a really good thing if they did actually do actively do pro peace propaganda. And it's been done before. Go back to the 30s in your country with Roosevelt, a huge propaganda drive, but a positive one. I think most people would agree to eliminate the worst poverty and to humanize working people. And that was a really good thing at the beginning of the New Deal that made a better country, better civilization. So propaganda can be used for good at the moment, because I'm trying to be realistic about it as well, but also because I want to just have sort of limited and achievable aims. I think if the national security state was not involved in making films, I think we'd still see a massive and significant change in the kind of output that we're getting in our popular culture. And I think that would in turn have a significant knock-on effect in terms of our overall society's overall discussions about foreign policy issues and about foreign countries. We only need to go back to the 1970s and look at a period of détente there, and a period where cinema suddenly became much more inventive, much more varied, in some cases much more left-wing. And that was a much healthier decade. It also was a decade in which the CIA and Department of Defense found it very difficult to, first of all, enact new wars in the global realm, but also they found it much more difficult to work on Hollywood films. They weren't able to do very much of that. Now, I'm not saying that the 70s was the greatest thing ever, but I am saying that this was a period when the Vietnam War was winding down, where America was not as aggressive on the global stage, and where there was a genuine rise of diversity, plurality, and a very active and effective peace movement, both on the streets and in the media.
What about a turn? This is a different kind of take, but what about a turn onto the domestic populations more? A focus onto them with some of the films and their impact on things. Did you look at the Judas and Black Messiah movie? Have you ever seen that?
No, I've not seen that one. I sometimes miss them these days. I was really on it, as you can imagine, until about 8 years ago. But there are a few that slip through my net these days.
It's about the Fred Hampton assassination, and I've spoken to friends who knew Fred Hampton, and I've looked into his assassination, not as much as I have with the Kennedy assassination. But if you watch the Judas and Black Messiah movie, they made Fred look a little bit like a thug. They kind of took it on a different take than necessarily what the documents kind of show about it, which kind of take the impact out of his death. I mean, the guy was 20 something years old, or 21 years old, like a young 20-year-old. And in the movie, the guy has a full on, he looks like he's 36. They could have got a younger actor to play the guy, but it takes a little bit more impact out of the feel that the audience gets to learn about Fred Hampton basically for the first time. Since a lot of people haven't heard his name. But I look at the domestic populations now and I start looking at the movies that are coming out. This utopian idea, many of these movies now are playing on this utopian, like perfect society type deal, futuristic style stuff. Like this is what the future is going to hold. It's like watching the Jetsons. Then you're pissed off that you don't have a flying car right now. Like there's a lot of this that's going on where I start going, I mean, is this kind of looking at like maybe we should be looking at the problems internally? Does that bring a deeper conflict in between us? There was a movie that came out. Oh God, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it gave people a fatigue about the world that really kind of woke them up to like the climate crisis. And it had them really thinking about like what do we got to do, produce changes? What do we got to do? I don't, it's not the day after tomorrow. It's it came out maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It'll come to me later. But they it really had people questioning and wondering to figure out like how do we fix this? How do we get the earth on the right track? That was a good movement that happened. But I feel like if you get that type of response, what can you get a type of response when it's the opposite way? A utopian idea and you start blaming certain things, you start looking at individual groups, you start targeting political stuff we start talking about. They made a whole movie, 2020, I think it was called, and it was like a satirical thing just jabbing Republicans. I'm not a Republican or Democrat. I probably believe more deep state, and I know everyone jokes about that, but I believe that more than ever. But I look at it and I go, you're really just going to divisivize people even more. You're going to make them go really onto the two-party thing and take away from the factor of that there's a lot of things that are going on that aren't necessarily two parties. It's deeper than that.
Let me just go back to, because you were mentioning Fred Hampton, Black Panther Fred Hampton. There's another film called Seberg, about Gene Seberg. I don't know if you saw that one. I just thought your listeners might be interested to know if they're interested in another kind of FBI conspiracy type film. Gene Seberg was a famous actress who got involved with the Black Panthers, and then she ended up dying in suspicious circumstances. I think it was more likely that she was not killed, but she was pressured into committing suicide, and it was a huge scandal. But they made a movie of Seberg about maybe 4 years ago, and I'd recommend that one to. So I've just done a bit of a spoiler, haven't I, by saying that she died? But actually, that's kind of very well known. But it's an interesting movie, not a brilliant movie, but still a good one. A bit like Kill the Messenger is as well, about what happened to Gary Webb, the journalist who was working in Central America. So there are all those kind of movies which are, they're out there, and they're well made, and they're pretty good.
But the turn on domestically, like I was mentioning about the utopian thing. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I see maybe possibly in the future more films coming out of just this utopian idea. And I think that brings bigger conflict amongst people because they're not looking at the core issue. They're looking at a perfect society or what the world could be like if we got our shit together. And when I say get our shit together, people start going, well, it's the other guys that are the reason why we don't have our shit together. And that's immediately what it turns on when it's like, no, this has been something that's been going on for a very long time. And it's probably to do with the fact that we keep going into endless wars for no apparent reason.
Yeah. I guess there are always trends, aren't there, going towards what the future is going to be like. So there's always going to be utopian imaginations. The extent to which that is, it's one of those things. I'm not sure if you can't really get rid of utopian visions. It's just people have them. So I guess they still reflect what kind of society, what kind of industry is building them. You go back to a film like go back to some of the Verhoeven films, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger film Total Recall, or the original RoboCop, for example. They're talking about sort of futuristic societies, which to some extent might appear utopian, where you've got kind of invincible policemen who can
Judge
go around
Dredd, man, Judge Dredd.
or Judge Dredd, yeah. So you have these visions, and I guess those films that I'm thinking of there reflected an ability for Hollywood at that time, that was around about 1990, to be able to do a really harsh critique of sort of capitalism, or kind of the nature of established entrenched power, and indeed of foreign policy in the case of Total Recall to some extent, or how well, yeah, there were foreign policy threads through that anyway. So, but that kind of ability of Hollywood to be able to give space to huge budget, sort of blockbuster budget films that are that level of critical, that happened with RoboCop and with Total Recall. I'm not so sure about Judge Dredd because I can't remember the film well enough. But that kind of space for kind of left wing criticism is probably gone, and so any of the critical material now is all relatively low budget, basically.
Judge Dredd showed a good amount about poverty and what happens when people get put in a position, but they also there's some type of similarities with the war on drugs, which is like there was a slow-mo drug that people were taking and it was getting littered on the streets, and these super cops were coming to basically take out these drug dealers and this kingpin or whatever. But I don't know, it pushes a little bit down on the drug aspects as well too, which makes it a different confusion to society, because in the United States over here we're legalizing so many drugs to the point where it's like, you have these two kind of conflicts. And I know there's been a good chunk of time, but there is still like a drug aspect, which is like people are ingrained to like, no, and I don't do drugs, but I just think like there's a weird conflict what you're doing with the public's perception on things. I mean, wait, you're going to make it legal if it's in your hands, but then if it's in someone else's hands, it's illegal. So it's just like you got two different messages being sent.
Yeah.
That wasn't really a question. That was kind of a rant. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, I'm sure I had a thought at the back of my head, but I've forgotten what it was.
What about your thoughts?
I can't stay on too much longer just because I've got to go early to my gig tonight.
What about your thoughts on? We've only been talking 45 minutes, but when it comes to what are your thoughts on Apollo 11? I mean, that NASA budget I saw recently, bro, that's insane, man. And that movie will make you 100% want to put all your money into space or whatever technology the government asked for.
I don't think I've actually seen it yet. I'm really sorry. I think I've seen a trailer for Apollo 11, but
oh my God, that's a sin against humanity right there.
Yeah, I've dropped the ball on that. Trying to think what I've seen lately. I didn't go to Guardians of the Galaxy yesterday because
it was really good.
Oh, was it? Okay. I was going to end up going with
Marvel knocked it out of the park for the first time. I don't see any propaganda in that film, and I wasn't necessarily looking for it, but I just don't see a whole lot of like influence on that one. If anything, it made me think of Marvel a little bit better. I feel like they've been kind of hitting some dead stumps for a little bit.
Yeah, I think most of the Marvel films have been impacted by the Department of Defense in some way or another. But I think Guardians of the Galaxy has escaped that. What did I see yesterday? I saw an old Stephen King movie yesterday about evil gypsies called The Thinner, which was terrible.
Oh God, I love that movie. That was a good movie.
You've seen that one, yeah. Nice and formulaic. I quite enjoyed it actually. And trying to remember what else I've seen.
Do you think Stanley Kubrick was exposed a little bit?
Well, yeah, you'd have to ask his biographers on that. I mean, Kubrick's obviously really interesting with all the conspiracies and mysteries that have flown around.
He had access to the original NASA moon mission plans, which is so weird to me.
He's certainly an amazing director. So I don't know. I don't feel I've got any sort of great insight on that. What do you think?
What about Stan? I just think it's weird that he got the NASA moon mission plans. I mean, I don't know. Why would the government give him access to those types of things as well, too? And then even if you don't, like, if you believe that there's conspiracy stuff, I mean, he was putting weird stuff in his films for a reason. Maybe that created his genius, but I don't think that helps with the amount of conspiracy theories that could be created. I mean, it's difficult for me since I'm making a film, which is kind of like, will I even have the option to get on a platform? Like, that's the thing is like, even if I have Netflix connections or if I know someone and have it in on there, would they accept a conspiracy film that's related to one of the most controversial events? And it's not even really conspiracy. It's just saying something different than that's a narrative, which leads into the question, does the government spend more money buying films or producing films in their narrative, or does it spend more money silencing films?
Well, I mean, I can help a little bit with the silencing of things. I mean, there's not a great deal of that we've come across of active suppression, but there is certainly there is floor to ceiling in some of the military offices of scripts that they have rejected for support. In other words, and that probably means that if they don't support them, the script requires the Department of Defense to support them with equipment or whatever. So by not supporting them, they are effectively meaning that they can never be made. And sometimes they do that for, and this is hundreds of thousands, this is millions and millions of pages of material. So we are aware that that the government could support a lot of anti-war, for example, productions, but they choose not to, and that essentially damns them. Sometimes I've referred to it as a graveyard of entertainment.
Is it
Basically, where
possible that
scripts are just gone to die.
they can have a relationship with like streaming services or just use the word national security to be able to pull? I had a video flagged off YouTube because I showed a JFK document that got reclassified. So that was a national security issue. But I just it didn't make sense if they had released it. You know what I mean? Like I don't know if they do that with Netflix. Like if I was going to pitch something to Netflix, would they just tell Netflix you can't? That's against national security. I mean, nobody's ever did a conspiracy aspect on the JFK assassination that's been on a mainstream platform before.
Yeah, I mean, the sensors and whether automated or not are really they seem to be uh, much more alert and vociferous than they really should be, and seemingly more than they were just a few years ago. I found it as well. I put up a speech that got into the paper a couple of days ago, so it was, it all been checked, it was all fine, and I put up a speech, and but it was taken down. It was one I did about propaganda in Hollywood and how it related to Benedict Cumberbatch and Sacha Baron Cohen, and that was taken down for. It was reinstated after I complained, but that was taken down for about 36 hours, 48 hours. And it seems to me that there's often now complaints about misinformation. I've uploaded. It was just a few weeks ago. I uploaded a friend of mine, Derek Swanson, who makes films in New York about the pandemic and things like that. I uploaded that to a private link just because I wanted to see it, to watch it through myself, just for my own convenience. I was going to edit a bit out. Even though I put it on a private link, they still said, "Yeah, you're not allowed to watch this because it goes against COVID misinformation." So it's like I'm quite surprised at how involved state censors are willing and able to be on normal social media platforms. It seems to be a kind of intervention that is really not warranted. So when Elon Musk, for instance, got rid of a bunch of people at Twitter, I mean, I don't know the case really well, but I was a bit like, well, that's probably a good thing because I don't want just thousands and thousands more people interfering with whatever is going on people's social media. Just clear them out. Twitter hasn't collapsed in the past few months. Seems to have done all right without a bunch of busybodies sticking their beaks in. But that's a fairly casual opinion that's not been based on a great deal of reading.
I'm curious if your film Theaters of War, if that happened to have any conflicts trying to get on a platform.
It's been okay. We're currently putting out a more commercial version of it, which has had to go through lawyers, which I think is costing quite a lot of money. But there is some backing for that. That's not to do with me, but to do with the distributor. So there's a lot of legal stuff and copyright stuff. But actually, it has worked out that we haven't had too many problems along that line so far. The film's been doing well. We've been touring it around. I went up to Scotland a few weeks ago to show at a really nice cinema and an art centre. I might be doing some more archival research with Roger, the executive producer, next summer.
Were people surprised after your film or watching it just to see the
Yeah,
influence?
I think people are. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of denial that comes in because sometimes people say, "Well, yeah, I already knew all that," and that's why I emphasised at the top of this discussion we had today how this just wasn't known. It wasn't even known until 6 years ago when me and Tom did our book on it. But certainly, if you go back, say 20, 25 years, there was absolutely zero evidence. That's an exaggeration, but close to zero evidence of government involvement of government control over the entertainment industry. But as a group, we've completely shattered that myth, and the world operates in a much more conspiratorial way than one might think, which is one of the reasons I end up doing quite a lot of conspiracy podcasts, because I've ended up in that world. But it just happens that that's what reality is.
Don't point at me as a conspiracy podcast. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I just don't necessarily agree with some of the stuff that's going on out there. But that recent documentation, or I guess in the past 25 years, I mean, we look at films now, look at back in the 20s and 30s when they're saying the Red Scare and they're doing all this type of stuff. It makes sense now where you look at it, you're like, holy crap, of course, this was all just pushing, to hate communism and broad brush that. And I don't know if I fully even understand what communism is 100%, but you really start examining just the amount of stuff that was getting pushed into people's heads. No wonder like other generations think the way that they do. And that's
Yeah,
so
and at
it's
different points in American history, different agencies have had different levels of power. So, for instance, from the 1930s until the 1970s, the FBI was a real player in the entertainment industry, uh, whereas the CIA wasn't doing really very much at that particular time. And the Department of Defense was not as significant. Well, let's say the FBI was a lot more significant, basically under Hoover, under J. Edgar Hoover. And when he died, the TV series, the FBI, which was the most popular television series in the States at the time, uh, once that ended, the role of the FBI over the past 50 years in film productions has lessened considerably. It still is around. It still is part of what you might call the national security state. It still has influence over some. And the CIA's fortunes but sorry, pre-war, the FBI was also really important in the 1930s. And then there were films like I Was a Communist for the FBI and all those kind of things. So they sort of had a fairly important presence. CIA formed in the late 40s, and the standard historiography about the CIA is that it didn't have the standard book on this is that the CIA was an absent presence in Hollywood from the mid 40s until the early 1960s. One of the things that me and Tom did, and I think it's one of the best bits of the book that we did actually, a sort of 15-page part of that in national security cinema, we demonstrate how that historian is mistaken on this. And actually, the CIA probably might not have even formed in 1947 if it hadn't laid the ground by them being involved in making three productions in 1946, which were laying the PR ground for its existence. And then beyond that, even into the 1950s, it was to call it an absent presence is a very light touch way of explaining it. It was basically suppressing a lot of films in the 1950s to the extent that there was not even any mention of the acronym CIA in any movie until 1959 with Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And then even after that, I think that the only film that mentioned it until 1962 was Dr. No, the James Bond film. And that mentioned it very briefly by mentioning that character, Felix Leiter, the CIA guy. Even though the CIA actually, I think it was CIA, worked on that first Bond film and provided the jetpack thing that he uses. So
That's interesting. They took secrecy to me like 100% secrecy. Like we don't
they
even
got
exist.
yeah. So they basically just squashed loads of things. But then throughout the 1960s and 70s, because there was a greater peace movement, the CIA found it harder to really do anything. And even into the 80s, it was not very successful. It didn't have an official office there. One of the things that happened in the mid 80s was that the CIA, that Marlon Brando, the actor, tried to bid for a script about the Iran-Contra affair. And he was outbid by a front company. And it turned out that front company was a CIA front company. And so they were able to take the script, buy it, and then just dump it, suppress it, so that he couldn't make a Hollywood movie about Iran-Contra. So there's a good, there are these kind of cases that are pickled around that do point to out and out suppression. Those kind of things do sometimes happen, and they're really interesting, of course, when they do.
Yeah, the whole history, honestly, of military influence is just a little bit. I don't know. I can't, like I said, I can't stop seeing it everywhere I look, which kind of sucks. But even if it's necessarily not even influenced by the military, I just kind of look at it like, oh, this has a propaganda message, 100%. Lone survivor. I almost signed up at a recruitment station, 100%. That's not a joke. So you get to that point, but Matt, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, man. I know you got to run, but where can people find your links? Any links you want to promote? Twitter, TikTok, anything like that?
I mean, if you can find me on Facebook, and probably the best place to find me is Facebook. The Writer with No Hands. That's the name of my first documentary, The Writer with No Hands. So you find me on there. I feel very out of date by being on Facebook. Hardly anyone uses it these days, as I understand it. Everyone just tells me it's for old people. And I do have the other things. I do have Twitter and Instagram, so you can find my name on that, Matthew Alford. It's just I don't really use them. So Facebook is best, but yeah, through any means that you like, you can chase me up. I'm somewhere on TikTok as well, but I can't remember what it is now.
LinkedIn?
Forget
LinkedIn? Got a LinkedIn?
no, I don't use LinkedIn. Just too annoying.
uh,
Uh,
Nobody does.
no, no. But yeah. If you want to look up probably the best thing that I've done over the past few years is the film Theatres of War. Uh, that came out last year, and then just because it's on my mind, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, an article came out in the Morning Star, which was um, uh, uh, about it was basically an anti-war statement, but as it ties into arts and culture and that kind of thing. So if people want to read my stuff, then please do follow. Please do look that up.
I'll link it in the description too for people to be able to click on. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.